Miller McCord. Hello, hello, hello. Check 1 2 1 2. Peter B. Collins, News and Comment. It's Thursday, August 3rd, 2017. Yesterday, I shared with you a link to the op-ed that I published in the San Francisco Chronicle, asking the people who run the Golden Gate Bridge to fix a traffic problem that involves tourists and the Vista Point. And I am happy to declare victory, because just hours later in the early afternoon, the Bridge District announced that they will be responding, maybe not to my demand, but to the demand of thousands of people who have complained. And they're going to shut down the Vista Point for the next 5 weekends up through the Labor Day weekend. I'm really pleased, and like I said, it could be quite coincidental. But I got a lot of great reaction to the op-ed on Facebook and from friends via email, and I thank you for that. And it's nice to actually see government responding in a situation like this. Well, the story that's going to be all over the corporate media today is the Washington Post's release of actual transcripts of the phone calls that we were told occurred back in the very early days, the weekend after the inauguration in January of this year. They were calls to allies, the President of Mexico and the President or Prime Minister of Australia. And these calls are even more embarrassing to us, and they should be to Trump if he actually experienced embarrassment. And let me say at the outset that while this is embarrassing to the White House, the leak appears to come from the National Security Council, past or present. This really is informational. It's educational. And it shows us that we've got an idiot in the White House. Now, most of us knew that. But we didn't know that this insecure man, who is always referring to himself, that's called myopia, and who has willful ignorance about certain subjects and arrogance that informs his belief that he knows it all. And in these conversations, you see these other world leaders struggling to maintain, a diplomatic exchange, trying not to insult the guy. He refers to his colleagues by their first names and they don't reciprocate. He alternately sweet talks and threatens them. That's pretty common of what we know of Trump's persona. And so these are truly embarrassing to the United States. And at the time, we had some inkling of that. But because the information we got was based on leaks and we hadn't seen a transcript, the White House was able to bat them down and say, oh, no, these were constructive calls and, warm and friendly exchanges with our allies. But it's not really the case. And while we don't know the actual source of this, the documents obtained by the Post contain notes indicating that they were reviewed and classified by retired Lieutenant General Keith Kellogg, Jr., who is the Chief of Staff on the National Security Council. So somebody in that orbit decided to embarrass the president by releasing these transcripts. And what we learn is that Trump brags and exaggerates about his power to impose tariffs on imports from Mexico as a way of threatening Peña Nieto, Enrique Peña Nieto, into going silent about the border wall. And this political issue is what Trump was most sensitive about in the call with Peña Nieto. And the Mexican president is very firm. This is your problem, Donald. He doesn't call him Donald. This is your problem, Mr. Trump, Senor Trump. And I'm not going to bail you out of it. And I don't have the political room to maneuver in terms of my domestic politics to offer you any kind of a fig leaf. And he repeatedly says, let's just not talk about this. And Trump insists, and he tries to basically threaten the Mexican president, saying, we're going to end the discussions that Jared Kushner is having with Luis. We don't actually identify who Luis is, clearly a subordinate of Peña Nieto. But what we learn from this is that Trump is threatening him and saying, I'll just throw up some tariffs and we won't even talk about it. And Peña Nieto is, I think, shows some real cojones. He doesn't back down. He's not intimidated by Trump, at least not from my reading of the transcript. Now, I've linked to the full transcript. It's in the show file for this podcast at peterbcollins.com. I recommend a stiff drink, or maybe two, as you peruse the stream of consciousness of the Trumper. So in the exchanges, he also flatly lied about certain things. For example, in an exchange with Peña Nieto, he says, we have the drug lords in Mexico that are knocking the hell out of our country. They're sending drugs to Chicago, L.A., New York, up in New Hampshire. I won New Hampshire because New Hampshire is a drug-infested den. There are a lot of people pissed about that in the live, free, or die state. Anyway, up in New Hampshire, the drugs, this is not even a complete sentence, is coming from the southern border. So we have a lot of problems with Mexico farther than the economic problem. We are becoming a drug-addicted nation, and most of the drugs are coming from Mexico or certainly from the southern border. But I will say this, you have that problem too. You have some pretty tough hombres in Mexico that you may need help with, and we're willing to help you with that big league. Now, he didn't say bigly, which is a common little phrase of his. He said big league. Well, first of all, the facts. Trump did not win New Hampshire, although he claimed to Peña Nieto that he had. Now, he only lost by 0.5 percentage point. Maybe you can forgive that he doesn't have an accurate recollection of that. In the call with Malcolm Turnbull, he was really rude, and he got upset with the prime minister because Turnbull, after a few pleasantries, turned the conversation to an agreement that he had worked out with Barack Obama to accept 1,250 refugees that were being held on an island off the coast of Australia. And Turnbull explains that Australia, under his administration, adopted this policy that they would not accept any migrants who came by boat because that rewards the pirates who traffic in refugees and migrants. And on one hand, you know, that might be a cold but rational explanation, but Trump doesn't get it. And he has to ask the prime minister to explain it more than once. And so he also seems to be obsessed with how things make him look. So in regard to these 1,250 migrants, and he calls them 2,000 and assumes that they're all criminals, he is worried because he had just issued his first executive order to ban immigration from 6 countries, to ban refugees for 90 or 120 days, and he was very concerned about how that was going to make him look. And similarly, his obsession with the public impression or perception that Mexico will pay for the wall is really crucial to the Donald. He doesn't care if it's real, and he basically tells, Peña Nieto, look, we can get the money to come out in the wash. But he doesn't want to, hear Peña Nieto publicly say that, he's not or that he's willing to pay for the wall or that he's even willing to discuss it. Also, here's an exchange. Enrique, if I can interrupt, this is with the Mexican president, this is not a new proposal. He's talking about tariffs. He said, I've been telling this to every group of 50,000 people or 25,000 people because no one got the people in their rallies as big as I did. I mean, this guy is so insecure. The president of Mexico doesn't care about the size of Donald Trump's rallies. And also, the proposal that caught Peña Nieto by surprise was a tariff on goods imported from Mexico to the United States. And Trump had earlier agreed that a tariff had not been discussed in the talks between Jared Kushner and, here's the detail, Mexico's foreign minister, Luis Videgaray. So this is here's another exchange here with Turnbull over the Australian refugee deal. This is going to kill me. I am the world's greatest person that does not want to let people into the country. It makes me look so bad, and I've only been here a week. In another comment, he says, I look like a dope. Well, yes, you do. All day long. And speaking of immigration, yesterday the president grandstanded in a White House press event where he trotted out a bill that is going nowhere so far. It's sponsored by the arch-conservative Arkansas Senator Tom Cotton and his colleague from Georgia, David Perdue. And this is a major reorganization of legal immigration. It would cut in half the number of people invited to come to our country every year, and it is described as a merit-based system that would bring people who can make a contribution to the American economy. And this is a lie. This is bullshit. Now, let me first say that I don't have any objection to overhaul, reform, review of our immigration laws. We have the right to do that at any time. But it should be part of a comprehensive effort. You can't just cherry pick one issue at a time. And now that Trump has friendlies in both houses on Capitol Hill, he could be pushing for a comprehensive plan. Instead, he loves to, float one idea at a time, pandering to certain parts of the Trump Republican base. So this idea that it's merit-based is a fig leaf. It is class-based. And we already have methods to attract upper-class people. They can buy a green card by investing. It used to be $1 million, but now it's only $500,000. And both Kushner and Trump have availed themselves of the buy a green card and invest in our properties transactions. Also, we have many smart foreigners who get into our colleges and universities, and they come here and either we H-1B them and allow them to stay, or they're given a green card. And so the idea that we need to eliminate the riffraff, that people who aren't wealthy or who don't have a tech or finance degree are somehow less worthy to enter this country. And the proposed rules would also limit the number of people who can apply because they have relatives here. It sharply reduces the range of relatives who could sponsor a non-citizen to emigrate to this country. And Tom Cotton said that low-skilled immigrants push down wages for those who work with their hands. Yes, he identifies with the little people. For some people, they may think that that's a symbol of America's virtue and generosity. I think it's a symbol that we're not committed to working-class Americans, and we need to change that. And we know that Americans are not going to pick grapes. They're not going to pick blueberries or peaches in Georgia. They're not, lining up to wash dishes. We rely heavily on immigrant labor. And here's Lindsey Graham, Republican of South Carolina. If this proposal were to become law, it would be devastating to our state's economy, which relies on this immigrant workforce. Hotels, restaurants, golf courses, he mentions, and farmers will tell you this proposal to cut legal immigration in half would put their business in peril. And already, agriculture is reeling. In almost every sector, in almost every part of the country, they do not have enough labor to harvest the crops this year. And Trump is oblivious because he is pandering to the emotional and, you would argue, philosophical, if they were smart enough, feelings or attitudes of the people who voted for him and ignoring the rest of us. And we can expect that to continue. In a tweet today, Trump blames the Congress for the U.S. Declining relationship with Russia. He says, quote, "Our relationship with Russia is at an all-time and very dangerous low. You can thank Congress, the same people that can't even give us H-care." Well, it's not H-care. It's dismantling H-care. It's denying people H-care, dude. But what's interesting about this is there are many people who, will look at this and say he's right. And I believe that Congress, in promoting these sanctions, is wrong. And I do think that Trump does have a bit of a point here, that Congress is poisoning, or at least attempting to put a big chill in relations with Russia, based on the unproven narrative that we have been talking about here for months now. There's also an effort, even including some Republicans, to put limits on presidential power. And this is interesting because we know that under Bush and Obama, the points of presidential power without requiring congressional approval, particularly in foreign relations and in war-making, surveillance, detention, that the Congress basically abrogated its responsibilities and just allowed the executive to expand. And so in the big picture, these efforts to put limits on the president, the latest are 2 bills from bipartisan members of the Senate to limit his ability to fire the special counsel, Robert Mueller. One bill by Tom Tillis and Chris Coons, who are both on the Judiciary Committee, is called the Special Counsel Integrity Act, and it would allow for court review of any firing of any special counsel. The Lindsey Graham, Cory Booker, Sheldon Whitehouse, Richard Blumenthal bill would go a step further, requiring the Attorney General to go to court seeking approval before removing any special counsel. Every day I take a second to thank the people who support my work with your subscriptions to the Peter B. Collins podcast, including Nato Preciado, who just renewed the annual subscription. Thank you, Nato. Natalie Reel, longtime loyal subscriber, Ethan Knox, and Stuart Russell. I really appreciate your support. And if you never hear your name called, and you're not a subscriber, why don't you fix that? Come on over to peterbcollins.com, click on the menu button, pull it down, click on Become a Subscriber, takes you to the sign-up page. From there, you can choose your options for a level of support that fits your budget. Robert Perry is back with another big story. It relates to the whole case of Magnitsky. And most Americans have trouble even pronouncing Magnitsky, and they don't know diddly about the Magnitsky Act. It's the one that put sanctions on Russia and led to Putin's ban on the export of Russian orphans for adoption in the United States. And Bob Perry has seen the documentary that billionaire hedge fund operator William Browder says is Putin propaganda. And this documentary, which is not permitted to be seen in the United States because Browder's lawyers have blocked any attempt to screen it publicly, except for one at the museum in Washington a couple of months ago. And what we learn from Bob Perry's story is that he busts the Magnitsky myth. For example, we are repeatedly told that Magnitsky was a Russian lawyer. Well, it turns out he was an accountant. And he is allegedly the whistleblower who discovered this tax fraud by the Russian government. And when Browder attempted to pursue it, Browder says that Magnitsky, the lawyer, not accountant, was jailed and then beaten to death while he was imprisoned. According to Bob Perry, Magnitsky's mother, number one, says that he died because of lack of medical attention, doesn't mention any beatings. She's the one who says he was an accountant and not a lawyer. And so there are many inconsistencies and inaccuracies in the testimony that Browder gave to the Senate and that was widely reported last week. And when you really drill down on this, this is, as Perry points out, the evidence suggests that Magnitsky was an accountant implicated in manipulating the books, not a crusading lawyer, risking everything for the truth. So I invite you to read Perry's excellent piece. There's a lot more that I don't have time to detail for you here. Caitlin Johnson John Stone, is the Australian rogue journalist who does a lot of coverage of American politics. And her latest piece, the headline is something I agree with. Seymour Hersh owes the world an explanation for his Seth Rich comments. Now, yesterday I shared with you some a lengthy recorded sequence of Seymour Hersh describing what he knows about the FBI's investigation into the murder of Seth Rich. And as you heard, Cy Hersh says that Seth Rich had in fact been in touch with WikiLeaks based on the forensics on the metadata on his computer, and that he had sent them some files from the DNC, what were described by Hersh as juicy emails, some samples, and that Rich was asking for money to release additional information. So this paints a different picture. It implicates Seth Rich as a possible source, and there could be more than one, of the information that got to WikiLeaks. But according to an NPR report, just on Monday, Cy Hersh cryptically said, "I hear gossip." This guy Butowski, who is the Republican who was fishing for Seth Rich's information, Butowski took 2 and 2 and made 45 out of it. Now, that's a very strange denial from Hersh. And in another quote, what Johnstone tells us is that Hersh, in a chat with Butowski, says, "Look, I'm not going to comment about that stuff. I mean, come on, I live in the real world." Now, based on what I played for you yesterday, Seymour Hersh's information deserves deep investigation. And looking at Seth Rich as a possible source of the WikiLeaks dump is not a conspiracy theory. It's not a fake news story. It's not something that is out of bounds or unreasonable. And Johnstone writes, if Hersh knows something about Rich, he needs to volunteer that information. If Hersh was lying to Butowski in the audio recording, he needs to volunteer that information. If the audio recording was somehow faked, he needs to volunteer that information. Either way, this urgently needs to be clarified because the consequences of the answers to these questions are far, far more important than Seymour Hersh. And a listener who goes by the handle of Fredbo dropped an email yesterday. Mr. Collins, well, you don't have to call me Mr. I continue to be impressed by your intellectual honesty when it comes to analysis of the media miasma encircling the DNC WikiLeaks Seth Rich Russia affair. You raise many interesting points, most saliently the fact that most of the sources of seemingly pertinent information wish to remain anonymous. And he identifies Big League Politics as the organization that received the Cy Hersh recording from a source that currently wishes to remain anonymous. This is another red flag in my book, says Fredbo. I also do not understand why, if it's WikiLeaks' policy to never release information on sources because the documents they publish speak for themselves, why would it retweet the Big League Politics story? What does WikiLeaks gain by doing this? Well, thank you very much, Fredbo. Appreciate your comments there. As you know, the one move recently that's been announced by the White House that I support is the ending of the CIA's covert operation to support and train the so-called Syrian moderate rebels. And we now learn that at least $1 billion has been spent on this misguided program that started under the Obama administration. It turns out to be one of the most expensive efforts to arm rebels since the CIA's program with the Mujahideen in Afghanistan during the 1980s that brought us one Osama bin Laden. And in an echo of the Hawks of Vietnam, we hear that this program may have been shut down without properly having allowed it to do its job. They never gave it the necessary resources or space to determine the dynamics of the battlefield. They were drip-feeding opposition groups just enough to survive, but never enough to become dominant actors. That's according to Charles Lister, a Syria expert at the Middle East Institute. And I think that's bullshit, because we did this for over 4 years. The base was in Jordan. And my former colleague, Sibel Edmonds, was one of the first to reveal that. And so another named source. This article is interesting. They actually name the people who are talking. General Raymond Thomas III, commander of U.S. Special Operations Command, said during a conference last month that ending the CIA program was a tough decision. At least from what I know about the program and the decision to end it, it was absolutely not a sop to the Russians. It was, I think, based on an assessment of the nature of the program, what we're trying to accomplish, the viability of going forward. Well, there's a lot more to this story, including the rat line that Cy Hirsch has confirmed of the weapons that were transferred from Benghazi, Libya, to the so-called moderates fighting in Syria. Today, I'm releasing to my subscribers an in-depth interview with an environmental scientist here in California who I've known for years, Greg Karras. Greg is the lead scientist with a group called Communities for a Better Environment, and he had a bird's-eye view of the recent negotiations, which didn't include environmentalists. It was Governor Jerry Brown and the oil industry, the energy industry leaders, who negotiated the extension of the cap-and-trade law. And they made a lot of dirty deals to make it happen. We detail that in the real story of Jerry Brown's cap-and-trade extension. Here's an excerpt from my conversation with scientist Greg Karras.
When I say the global footprint of California's oil industry is bigger than the politicians who like to call themselves climate champions are willing to admit, this is real, and this is something that we know about because my bosses in the community, the people who are going to too many funerals from the toxic pollution on the fence lines, tell me that it's my job to research this and tell the truth about it. So we told the truth about it at the Senate hearing. They used the T word to describe us in response rather than address the facts. But the fact is...
T for?
Terrorist.
Really?
Political terrorists.
Really?
Yeah. Governor Brown said that about his opposition on the left and on the right. And the opposition on the left wasn't to the mainstream environmental groups. Only the Sierra Club and the environmental justice organizations stood up to oppose this bill. Others were intimidated. But everybody knows that cap-and-trade has failed here to address the oil sector so far.
Well,
and that's
Greg,
what they're covering up.
I invite you to listen to the full interview with Greg Karras, and you'll get quite an idea of the horse trading and ugly deals that were made to win Republican votes, to get industry support, and to preempt existing pollution and carbon controls without an adequate replacement. Well, the wrecking crew over at Trump's EPA, led by Scott Pruitt, has hit some court-ordered roadblocks. Late yesterday, the EPA announced that they will not delay an Obama-era regulation on smog-forming pollutants from smokestacks and tailpipes. This is on order of the U.S. Court of Appeals for the District of Columbia, and that's good news. Also, in a case regarding the methane rules that were formulated by the Obama administration, and an effort was made to kill them by Scott Pruitt at the EPA, the U.S. Court of Appeals for the D.C. Circuit delivered a setback. The decision says that the delaying of implementation of Obama-era rules can be successfully challenged in the courts, and they rejected the EPA's move to stay the methane rule, issuing 2 rulings in the month since the EPA tried to delay implementing that rule. So that is encouraging that the courts appear to be willing to slow down, if not stop, the wrecking crew at the EPA. And there's I don't know if I'd call her a whistleblower, but Elizabeth Sutherland, who'd been an executive at the EPA, ended her 30-year career there on Monday, and on Tuesday promptly told The Intercept the details of what's going on. And what happens is you can make comments on the EPA website, and a lot of industries regulated by the EPA have done so. So have many consumers and scientists and activists. But the political appointees at EPA cherry-pick the ones from industry and then assign them to staff and they give them 24 hours to respond and say, can we roll back this rule? And you've got the American Public Power Association asking to revise the cooling water intake rule that kills fish. There are just many other these regulations that are found costly or burdensome by energy operators and other resource extractors, and they are seeking and winning relief from the EPA. We've been following the effort by the Congress to impose an AIPAC-written bill that would sharply penalize people and corporations who criticize boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. And her rationale is weak, but I applaud the move of New York Senator Kirsten Gillibrand, a Democrat, who has withdrawn her sponsorship for the bill after meeting with the ACLU and getting an earful at a town hall meeting in Queens. So if you went to Queens and gave her that earful, you were talking for me. So what she has said is she wants the bill rewritten to address the civil liberties concerns. And here's a quote from her. "This is only applying to companies. This applies to those working to undermine foreign policy. It has to be very specific that someone who is in favor of BDS can speak their mind, and someone who is against it can speak their mind, but you are always allowed to speak your mind. So I'm going to try to get the bill revised so there's no ambiguity, that it's just an extension of this foreign policy, which I think does make sense." Not to me, but still, backing away from the bill is a good thing, Senator. So keep that in mind. And finally today, kudos to Bernie Sanders, because I haven't heard a single Democrat speak up about this, including Tom Perez, who most recently was the Labor Secretary before he displaced Keith Ellison in the run for Democratic National Committee chair. The dispute is in Mississippi at a Nissan plant. Nissan, of course, is the Japanese-based car manufacturer that made $6 billion in profits last year, and Bernie really lets it rip. He doesn't put any limits on his call to support the 80% African-American workforce at Nissan in Canton, Mississippi, in their effort to form a union. Now, in Mississippi, like many other right-to-work states, it's very difficult to form a union. But these workers are fighting hard. The company is fighting back with a lot of propaganda and a lot of selective punishment of people. And Sanders points out that Mississippi is the poorest state in the country. 30% of their children live in poverty. Average weekly wage is a mere $727, the lowest in the nation. And that's why Nissan made its plans to build its plant in a community with people who don't make much money. That lays the groundwork for further exploitation. And I'm glad to see Bernie Sanders speaking up. As I've pointed out, the Democratic Party no longer aligns with organized labor. They want to talk about workers in a Trump sense, and they do so at their own peril. Thanks for joining me for this News and Comment podcast. It's free every day and available on YouTube. I'm Peter B. Collins.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to you. Keep smiling.